today, compliance and cybersecurity. It's like peanut butter and jelly. Quickly, we're going to go through today's agenda. I'm going to take you back to school at first, go through some definitions. I want to talk about your compliance journey, frameworks and commonalities. What are some of the risks? CMMC deep dive with our expert Joy, and then we'll really get into how technology helps, and then we'll have a Q&A. So, what is regulatory compliance? Simply put, compliance is when a business follows state, federal, and international laws and regulations relevant to its operation. So I'm sure most of you already know this, but I figured it's a good place to start. What is a compliance framework? A little bit more school. It's a set of guidelines and best practices. Organizations follow the guidelines to meet regulatory requirements, of course, improve their process, strengthen security, and achieve other business objectives such as, becoming a public company, selling cloud solutions, government agencies, and so forth. And here are a few that we'll talk about at least at a high level, and some do a deep dive into of some of the frameworks we'll be discussing today. I think it's important here to talk about NIST. And what is a NIST? NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We're going to be referencing it quite a bit throughout the presentation today. NIST is an agency of the U.S. Department of Commerce. It governs things such as power, transportation, water, telecommunications, and even the scales that measure how many pounds of bananas you buy at the store. But today we're going to be focusing on two parts, and maybe even a third one with Joy. And the first one is going to be NIST 853, that is security and privacy controls for information systems and organizations. And the other one is 800-172 Rev 2, and Joy will most likely touch upon 172 as well. And that is controlling, and that is about controlling classified information in non-federal and non-federal systems and organizations. Interesting fact, so about 6 years ago when this framework came out, and NENS was really getting serious about cybersecurity, we started to adopt this framework and started going through the self-assessment and putting these controls in place. All right, so that's enough school and definition. School's out for summer. Let's talk about you and your compliance journey. So where are you in your journey? Companies usually head down 4 different paths. Nobody jumps into compliance and says, that seems like a great idea today. I'd love to just, become compliant because it's fun. Like that just doesn't happen. So a lot of people do it. NENS started off, as I mentioned, is because we want to be secure. So what's out there? What are the frameworks that are out there where I can follow and put checks in the boxes and make sure that we're doing everything we need to do so that we can run a good business and be as secure as possible. The other one is that you need to be secure. You have to meet a regulation. So we're going to talk about, if you're governed by SEC, you have to meet it. You're going to be audited. So there's just a need and a requirement to meet the regulation. Some people get into it because they want to win a contract, and the only way to win a contract is it says you have to be compliant with these regulations. And they say, okay, well, I want to be able to do business with that sector, so I need to go do this if I want to win that business. And then this is the place where a lot of people don't want to be. You don't want to be in the position where, oh my God, I need to keep a contract, or I need to keep the doors open, and the C-level change, and if I don't become compliant really fast, I'm going to close my doors, or I'm going to lose the large contract that keeps my business up and running. So it's a question of where you are in your journey, and what steps after that you need to take. So let's talk about compliance frameworks. Although there are a lot of different compliance frameworks that we talked about, like NIST and CMMC and SOC and SEC, the compliance framework is just a set of guidelines and best practices. Organizations follow them to meet regulatory requirements, improve process, strengthen security, and so forth. So this is what those compliance frameworks are, or a few of them we'll cover today. So the thing about them is that all these frameworks are rooted and very specific. They have a lot of commonalities, if you will. So there's frameworks and the commonalities. We talked about the frameworks. Now let's kind of jump into the commonalities. All of these are underpinned by policies and procedures. This is where you take the time to be really thoughtful about what you're doing and how you do it, and you write it all down and you say, can we operate the business this way? Other things that are common is with all of these is you're protecting some type of information, even if it's the CUI, patient data, financial. Really, in other areas, you're ensuring that people are not using information for personal gain, fraud, and etc. With all of these, you need to understand where you are, and then you need to put together a poem or a gap analysis. So in that, it's like, okay, well, let me fill out all these questions. Let's figure out exactly where I stand in all of these standards. Which ones am I meeting? Which ones am I not? And then from that, you create the gap analysis or POAM, which stands for Plan of Action and Milestones. So that just kind of sets you up to tell you, okay, where am I in my journey, and what exactly do I need to do, and over what period of time do I need to get these things accomplished? Next part that's pretty common across all of these is showing proof. So have you done the work, right? Do you have the processes in place? Can you show that this is how the business is actually running and doing the right things? Indelible records, meaning records that cannot be changed. So what do you have for logs, audit logs, change controls, video, any other type of data that if anybody was to come to you and say, hey, I need to look at what happened on this day, or I need to see this version of this particular thing, you need to be able to produce these indelible records, and they need to know that there was no way that they could have been changed. And of course, there are governing bodies, for these things. Now, this is where, for sure, not all things are created equal. Some of these require that you're certified by a third-party auditor. Some of them you can self-certify on your own. It just depends on which one you're working on, what the framework is. We're going to cover a little bit later in the presentation what some of the risks and penalties are, by not understanding and not following some of these regulations. And I'm also going to show you how a lot of these regulations and frameworks kind of have some overlap and are interconnected in a minute. So compliance in industry. Quick slide, of which ones are associated with which: HIPAA, medical and life sciences, SEC, financial, publicly traded organizations, SOC 2, any organization bound to protect data, SOX, of course, publicly traded orgs, CMMC, government suppliers and contractors, and I'm sure the list can get bigger, but just as a quick reference note here. So, how many people have heard this one before? Compliance is an IT problem. We at NENS hear it all the time because everybody would like to make this somebody else's problem. Nobody wants to really have to deal with this. But the fact of the matter is that it's really not an IT problem. Only 10 to 20% of this is technology, is IT related. The other 80 to 90% of it is people, process, and technology controls. And when I speak with auditors, no matter who I talk to, they tell me this line all the time, is that this is what people need to understand. It's a very important concept that needs to be communicated throughout the organization. And it's also very important that people in the organization understand that they play a critical role in compliance itself. But it's, well, how do I do this, right? How do I get people to help and how, play that particular critical role? Well, cybersecurity and IT enable that 80 to 90%. You can't rely on people to do this all on their own, right? Having checklists written down somewhere and keeping track of things. So you need to leverage technology to be able to accomplish this 80 to 90%. We don't have time to deep dive into all of the different frameworks, but I figured I would look at HIPAA and talk a little bit about how HIPAA compliance and NIST security rules are somewhat intertwined. And I have a next slide that talks about a crosswalk that's going to show you exactly, where some of the NIST regulations cross over to HIPAA as well. But I just want to cover a few of these things because we talked about them just a minute ago. So in HIPAA, there are administrative safeguards, right? So the commonalities, risk assessment, that's basically doing the analysis, and then having a risk management plan. What are we doing to mitigate the risk? How are we training our workforce? Do we have a plan in place for that stuff? That's that POAM and gap analysis. And what are we doing and what technologies are we using? Physical safeguards. What technologies do we have in place? Of course, there's the standard stuff like lock and key. So facility access, who can gain access to stuff. and who has, and then of course there's, you know, security devices and so forth, and then technical safeguards, that audit system, right? So how are we keeping track of the audit system? Access, not only minimizing who has access, but being able to report on who accessed the information. What type of controls are put in place, right? All of those things are part of the, you know, the NIST standards and the gap analysis and the poem that I mentioned before. So quick slide here on NIST and HIPAA rule crosswalk. So what you have here is it talks about the category under NIST, which is asset management here. And then the next category over, which is the subcategory, defines what is the actual NIST control, right? So there are about 110 NIST controls, and Joy will talk a lot about that in a little bit here. But then what are the relevant control mappings to whatever whatever regulation that you are bound by? So you can see there's a couple here from COVID to ISO, but you can see that the HIPAA rules. So like I said, a lot of these things are intertwined, right? So and that's why I mentioned before that when NENS had looked at hey, let's follow a framework, NIST covered so much of what's covered by all of the other frameworks, so that we felt that that was a great place for us to start. And we took many of our clients down this particular path as well when they came to us and they were concerned about security. So risks, risky business. You know, what if I don't comply? Well, it's a little bit different across the board depending on which one we're talking about. With HIPAA, there aren't people knocking on doors and saying, hey, let's do an audit. But if you have a breach and you're governed by HIPAA and they come in and then they audit you to understand what happened, the penalties are really large, you know, like $1,000 plus per record that's lost in a breach. So it can get really expensive if you don't do the right thing. So again, really nothing up front as far as teeth are concerned, people coming in to audit you, but you know, if you don't follow the rules and something goes wrong, it's a business ending event. You know, SOC 2 and SEC, both of those have some level of audit, right? So there's a third party that's going to come in, they're going to take a look at exactly what you're doing, what are your practices, you know, do you have the proper things in place? And you'll go through that, and if you don't have them in place, you know, you'll lose your certification, which you know also can come along with some fines or maybe not being able to do business and so forth. So there are teeth to these things in one way, shape, or form, either in the front end or on the back end, depending on what happens. And since Joy is so better qualified than I am to talk about CMMC and the risks, I'm going to hand it directly over to her. So.
Okay, Joy, I'm making you presenter.
Sounds good. Michael, I have to say the slide that you shared out on the frameworks and the commonalities was just fantastic. That's one of my favorite slides that I've seen. So are you seeing my master presentation slide?
Yep.
Okay, super. Let's go ahead and dig in. What an honor it is for me to be here. Thank you. The reason that Michael refers to me as somebody more qualified than perhaps he is for the CMMC framework is those of you who are familiar with CMMC know that the organizations who are out there doing the actual assessing, third-party assessments for the defense industrial base. I am one of those assessors. I'm a provisional assessor, and then I'm also a provisional instructor. So not only have I written the curricula for what the assessors are learning in order to go through their certification boot camps, I'm teaching it. And it's really an honor to be here as a guest, because anybody that is willing to listen to how important CMMC is and let me kind of help them digest it, I'm really happy for that opportunity. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and so let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to do the 10,000-foot view of what is CMMC. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper in certain areas, but if your organization needs to align with CMMC, hopefully this is going to help you just get a little bit more of a picture for what this is going to entail for you and your team. So as part of that, the federal government is concerned with two types of data that's being shared out with their contracting organizations. So they're partnering with a lot of organizations. When they issue the actual contract for what they're purchasing, that's called FCI, or Federal Contract Information. Now, it may seem like that information itself shouldn't be considered sensitive, but it actually is. The reason is that I'll use an example of like special night vision goggles that the Department of Defense may want to order for their troops who are overseas. And the contract itself that they issue, the purchase order, if you will, would have a description of what the item is, where it's going to be shipping, when it's going to be shipping, and how many are going to be included as part of that contract. Just that information, if it got into the wrong hands, could actually put our troops in harm's way. So understanding the sensitivity of FCI, or Federal Contract Information itself, is important. By the way, there's a ton of acronyms in cybersecurity in general. When it comes to CMMC, which stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, there are more acronyms than any other framework I've seen. So bear with me, I'll try to catch myself and explain these acronyms as we go. The second type of information, sensitive information, that the Department of Defense is concerned about is called controlled unclassified information. Notice that classified information is not part of the CMMC program. Classified information is a breed all its own in the data protection and sensitivity world. So controlled unclassified information is the type of information that's generated under a contract. For example, in the night vision goggles scenario that I just gave you for the FCI, perhaps as they are producing, the company that's producing these night vision goggles, they have special types of features or sensitivity built into those night vision goggles that is considered intellectual property, and it separates this type of night vision goggles from others. So we don't want our adversaries to get their hands on this type of critically sensitive information, right? So CUI. With the CMMC program, FCI is considered level 1, and then CUI, depending on how sensitive it is, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into this, that's considered level 2 or level 3. Now, the examples I've given you so far are for the Department of Defense. However, there's a lot more government agencies out there that deal with FCI and CUI. As a matter of fact, if we take a look at this, the Department of Defense is one of many. So the DoD is rolling out CMMC in order to protect their sensitive data, kind of as the ones that are testing the waters for how is this going to work with the defense industrial base. And every other agency that you see here is going to be watching closely for the success of this program, because we expect that many of them are going to adopt CMMC, or at least the cybersecurity control program that CMMC is based on, in moving forward with protecting their own sensitive data. So the idea around CMMC was really born out of a need. The first is that when the Department of Defense does any of their acquisitions, so the purchases that they put out there in the ecosystem, they've always said you have to make sure to give us a fair price for what you're doing. You have to deliver it on schedule, perform according to the terms of the contract, and you have to do it in a secure manner. You notice that there's only kind of a half a pillar for the cybersecurity, and that's because right away they discovered, for example, China came out with the J-31, which is the United States F-35 bomber, before the United States got that off of the production line. And that was really embarrassing, and it was a huge exfiltration, if you will, of intellectual property that the United States had been working on that went directly into our competition's hands. Not even competition, adversaries. Adversaries, that's an important word to say. So when that happened, they took a look back in 2016 and said, wait a minute, if we're going to be doing procurement from outside organizations, we're going to have everything be based on a platform of cybersecurity, because cost, schedule, and performance don't even matter. It's not going to be effective if it's not delivered in a secure way. Hence the birth of what we call DFARS, 252-204-7012. Another acronym, DFARS, that's the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. It's basically the laws governing how they do their purchasing. This one, titled Safeguarding Covered Defense Information, is based on 110 controls that are curated out of that NIST catalog that Michael talked to us about. NIST 853 is a catalog, has thousands of controls in it. And what NIST did is they took 110 of those and said, let's focus on confidentiality of data, and let's make sure that everybody in the defense supply chain, or the defense industrial base, DIB, is going to implement all of these 110 controls. It was introduced in 2015, amended in 2016, and the deadline for all of this to be implemented was 2017, the end of 2017. It also included things like make sure that you report a cyber incident within 72 hours. Really important, because what happened is that they continued to receive notification that breaches were occurring in the defense industrial base. They still were having exfiltration of data well past 2017. And so they had to take a look at what else can we do to make this stronger. Important to note, DFARS was self-attestation. Everyone in the defense industrial base was told you have to implement these 110 controls, and they were given a deadline, but they didn't have to submit proof. And the proof happened that they were not doing it when they continued to have so many breaches, right? So enter CMMC. There was a series of interim DFARS rules that said, all right, over the next several years, you're going to have to not only install these or implement these controls, but we're going to have a third party come in and assess you. Now, what that looks like, at level 1, remember level 1 was federal contract information, and we talked about what that means. But for controlled unclassified information, or CUI, all of those organizations are going to be at level 2 or level 3 now. And that means that beyond 17 basic controls, that I'll show you what those controls are in just a minute, they have to implement all 110, and a large portion of them, every 3 years, are going to have a third-party firm come in and verify that they've implemented all of those controls. Some of them can still do a self-attestation. We'll talk about what that looks like. And then there's going to be a portion at level 3, and this is for critical infrastructure, really. This is like nuclear systems, critical weapons that will fall into level 3, and that's where NIST 800-172 will come in. That program has not been baked enough for us to expand on the details. So NIST 800-171 and a FAR clause is really what compromises CMMC, levels 1 and level 2. So let's look a little bit deeper. Important to know, though, CMMC has undergone a couple of revisions. So when the second revision came out in February of 2022, the CMMC 2.0 confirmed we still want third-party assessments, and we still will allow some self-assessments depending on the level of sensitivity or category of CUI that your company is dealing with. So level 1, those 17 practices are based on what's known as the FAR clause. I'm not expecting everyone to read through these and understand them, but I'm going to point out how basic they are, because it seems like it's a lot of cybersecurity lingo. But if you look over here in the right-hand column, 2/3 of the way down, it says provide protection from malicious code. What is that, Michael? It's antivirus. Antivirus. Like, these are not rocket science cybersecurity controls. These are very basic cybersecurity that whether or not you have any kind of a federal contract with the government, all of these should be implemented in your business, from a small business to an extremely large enterprise level business with multiple sites. All of these. Escort visitors, monitor their activity while they're on site, maintain logs of who's coming in and out. All of these are just really good business sense and business practice. The next thing I'm going to show you is that, like Michael showed with HIPAA, NIST 800-171 is not reinventing the wheel. All of these controls, as I said, like access control, this is a whole family of cybersecurity controls for CMMC. Access control maps directly with NIST 853, that catalog of controls, but it also maps with the FAR clause I just showed you, all of the basic controls. It maps with the NIST cybersecurity framework. It maps with the Center for Internet Security. If you know anything about cybersecurity, you're going to recognize a lot of these. So they're all born out of the same families, if you will. And that's one of the things that's an advantage. If you're an organization that has fairly decent cybersecurity and you've been following a different framework, you don't have to start at square one. You can use this map for CMMC and see what you already have in place and build from there. Okay. Now, as I said, CMMC has 3 different levels: FCI, and then some sensitive CUI at level 2, and critical CUI at level 3. One of the things that's important to note out of all of these different combinations of controls that need to be implemented, as I mentioned, is that we have self-attestation for all of level 1 and some of level 2. Now, when CMMC 2.0 came out and the DoD said you can still self-attest for some of these controls, there was a huge celebration in the marketplace, because all of those defense industrial base organizations were saying, whew, we don't have to pay to have a third-party firm come in. We can just tell them we're doing the controls, but we'll just do our best. We'll do our best. We'll say, yes, we are doing it. We'll do our best. And then what happened is that the DoD made it very clear that we are going to back up, allowing you to self-attest with some policing. What does that look like? Well, all right, first of all, the DoD will have no sympathy if you claim that you don't understand or you didn't have the money to get all of these controls implemented. If they go in and do a random assessment, or if you are caught having some kind of a breach and they walk in and you haven't done what you say you're going to do, there is zero sympathy. All right, that's being backed up in everyday messaging coming out from the DoD. Officials are clearly stating if you're signing a contract, you're attesting at a minimum that you're meeting the DFARS and the FAR clauses, at a minimum, all right? In addition to that, they're holding up the False Claims Act. For the first time in history, they're using cybersecurity as a way that they can leverage the Department of Justice to take action and levy penalties against an organization who's caught not implementing all of the controls according to their contract. Now, interestingly, specifically, when we talk about the False Claims Act, this is really a big liability. And it's not just if you happen to be randomly assessed by the Department of Defense that you might get caught. There's a thing called a whistleblower. A whistleblower is an internal actor, an internal information security, managed service provider, somebody that's responsible for implementing your cybersecurity. And let's say that you tell them, look, I know that we don't have this in place yet, but go ahead and just say that we do, and we promise by next year we're going to get it implemented with you. And you're expecting someone who is doing those controls to sign off on your behalf without actually doing it. Those people have an opportunity now to report you to the Department of Justice and make 30% gets paid to them directly for bringing a prosecutable case to the Department of Justice. 30% in the 2 examples being held up by the Department of Defense equaled over $3 million for 2 different whistleblowers. That's a nice payday for someone who's concerned about the security of the organization and is not being listened to and is being asked over and over again to attest that your organization is doing something that it's actually not. So have that on the radar. Now, I talked about external service providers. I'm going to circle back to that because in CMMC, external service providers play a much larger role than most organizations understand. So let's say an organization like Michael's, NENS, is in charge of your cybersecurity and doing things like patching. And we'll talk a little bit more about what a lot of organizations will outsource to an external service provider because they may not have the bandwidth or the resources to do that internally. The DFARS clause, all the way back from DFARS 2012, has called out 3 different types of external service providers that are part of the cybersecurity profile that you're attesting to them doing their job correctly, right? So we have managed service providers, managed security service providers, and then cloud service providers. Google, Microsoft, AWS, Dropbox, all of these cloud solutions that an organization uses, they are responsible for security of that data if you are storing your CUI or your FCI in their environment. All right. So any subcontractor that has access to the systems where the sensitive data is stored or processed is going to have to demonstrate their ability to protect it. So currently it's in DFARS, and then it's going to get exploded in importance with CMMC because they become part of the actual assessment. All right. Let's look at the normal things at a very basic level. Organizations like Michael's, who do this really well, are going to provide at least all of these and then probably another 30 or 40 aspects of cybersecurity controls within CMMC. So when we're talking about those 110 controls, a robust managed service provider with a large contract with an organization that has to abide by CMMC, a robust service provider is going to be providing half of those services, right? Half of them or more. And depending on the terms of their contract and what the needs are for that organization. So it's really important that you're partnering with the correct managed service provider to get you through this. If you are working with a managed service provider that's not familiar with CMMC, that doesn't know what the NIST 800-171 controls are, who's not aware of what their responsibility is, and they say, oh yeah, don't worry, show me the list, I'll verify that you're doing all of those, and we'll be ready for an assessor to walk in the door. Boy, are they wrong, and boy, will you be wasting money. Let me show you why. When we're talking about the journey, Michael was talking about how important the journey is as you're getting compliant. For CMMC, I'm going to show you a list of things that you had better have ready and in really good working order to be able to hand over to an assessor team the minute they walk in the door. Actually, this is before they walk in the door. Organizations like mine, as a certified third-party assessor organization, organizations like mine, if we get a call from an organization that wants to have an assessment done, we're going to say, all right, show me this list, and I'll tell you whether or not we'll accept you as a client to do the assessment and whether you're ready and how much it's going to cost you. So the maturity of what I'm about to show you can determine if you even get any firm to agree to do the assessment, because if you're a mess, they'll spot it instantly from this list before they even walk in to do the assessment. All right, I'm going to call this my golden list. Here we go. A system security plan. If you don't know what an SSP is, it's an outline of every single control, those 110 controls, demonstrating how you've implemented them, and it includes a complete asset inventory. The assets have to be categorized correctly. And that's a whole nother ball of wax, making sure that you've categorized these sufficiently. The next thing on the list. Now, Michael was talking about a POAM. People say POAM like everybody knows what it is. It's a plan of action and milestones. I would liken a POAM to a project map that breaks out everything you need to do for a certain project, groups them according to priority, and assigns resources and money associated with completing that phase of the project plan. When all of those different phases of a project plan are complete, you've completed a program. The plan of action and milestones demonstrates how did you do a self-assessment internally? What did you find that still needed to be corrected or remediated? How did you prioritize those? And then how did you check them off one by one? And I want you to show me the completed version of that, right? Next thing, all of the policies and procedures that you've written up for most of those controls. Remember, Michael said that 80 to 90% of this relies on people and processes, not just technology. People and processes. How do you prove you have an administrative control in place if you don't actually have the policies, the procedures, and you have taught them to all of your staff? So you'd better have a lot of documentation in order, okay? The next thing, shared responsibility matrix. Remember, we talked about this. Some of those things a managed service provider is going to be doing. Some of them, Google or Microsoft Azure, Office 365 are going to be doing. Whoever is involved in that supply chain of protecting that data has to demonstrate what their responsibility is versus what your responsibility is for every one of those 110 controls. If your MSP doesn't know how to do a shared responsibility matrix, move on. Find someone like Michael's firm that knows how to do it. Next thing, infrastructure map. I want to know every building that you have in your infrastructure. I want to know which ones house the controlled unclassified information or the federal contract information. I want to know the ones that are out of bounds or out of scope, and why. Tell me why. If you say, hey, our Michigan office has never touched CUI, they have nothing, all they do is marketing. Good. Okay, next. Within that infrastructure, I want to see where are your firewalls, where are your switches and your routers, where are all of the actual endpoints or laptops for remote workers that are processing this critical information. Every single thing has to be shown, every part of that asset inventory. Remember, system security plan and the asset inventory. If it's in scope for the assessment, it had better be represented on your infrastructure map. In addition, I want to see a data flow diagram. So when FCI comes into your environment, who sees it, who touches it, where is it stored, who's it transmitted to, and how does it ever leave your organization if it does. Same thing for CUI, controlled unclassified information. Between those two documents, I'll have a really good picture that you understand every aspect of how you are handling, processing, and storing this sensitive information. And I can confirm that the scope that you're telling me I need to assess makes sense. If you say, oh, just do our whole organization, you could be spending tens of thousands of additional dollars. If you say do all of our 5 sites instead of just this one, you could be spending so much extra money. So scoping and defending that scope with the bottom 2 documents is going to be critical. So I'm going to wrap up by saying that CMMC is not new in wanting to establish trust. I mean, what we're really talking about, what Michael, I, and Ted are talking about when we have this kind of conversation with any organization that's trying to wrap their head around what does compliance mean, what is a framework, why do we have to do it, what happens if we don't do it. We need to establish trust between the government, the financial system, the healthcare system, the manufacturing system, the defense industrial base, all of that. Human resources has to step up. Information security has to step up. The organizational culture as a whole for every business, every single business, security has to be baked into the culture. So a compliance framework is one way of having you check the boxes and say, all right, now we need to bring in human resources and make sure they understand what training is needed in order for us to check the box for CMMC. But you know what? Better than that, have HR understand how important security training is for everything they do, not for CMMC. Allow that to check the box for CMMC, but for everything they do. This is really a game changer when it comes to organizational culture. And organizations like Michael's, like mine at Edwards Performance Solutions, you know, I have a deep, deep mission to protect the defense industry. Michael has a similar mission, not just with defense, but with healthcare, with financial services, all of that. So rely on us, come to us. I'm happy to answer any questions. We do have a boot camp available for anybody that is trying to implement CMMC. And if you want to partner with Michael on whether it makes sense for you to go to one of these boot camps, we do have a lot of consultants, but most importantly, a lot of organizations themselves who need to go through CMMC are getting their CCP because it's 5 days of foundational knowledge. What I just walked through in like 25 minutes, I'm sorry it took so long. Everything I just walked through is a tiny, tiny bit of what you learn in the 5-day boot camp so that you can really do CMMC well. So I just said a whole bunch. Sorry for the verbal barfing on everybody, but I'd love to have questions, and I'm going to hand it back over to Michael so that we can have him take us home now.
Yeah, so before we do that, so let's, I want to invite our audience, if you have questions for Joy or Michael, please drop them in the Q&A feature, but I do want to throw out one question that's come up. Joy, talk to us a little bit about CMMC 2.0 and the timeline, because there's a lot of confusion about that. So 2.0 was the big revision to CMMC, which you talked about.
Yeah, it's happening a lot faster.
When do organizations need to be compliant?
Okay, there's 2 things to take into account when we're talking about timeline. The first is when the government is going to be ready and starts to add it to contracts. The second is if you already have a contract, how does that affect you? So the first part of that, March of 2023, they expect to have everybody's input from the industry on CMMC 2.0. They will start to incorporate those changes and start to add the final version into contracts in May of 2023. There's a 60-day period between March and May where they're going to fully bake it and say, all right, we're starting to add it to contracts now. CMMC level 1, level 2, or level 3 will start appearing in these contracts. Now, if you already have a contract, let's say that you have a 5-year contract that just started this year, CMMC is not going to affect you and be in that contract language until you renew. So, all right, you have 4 more years, but don't forget, CMMC is on top of DFARS 7012. DFARS 7012 is not going away, and DFARS 7012, I guarantee you, is in your contract right now. So they could walk in the door and they could do a surprise assessment any minute, and they can take that contract from you under DFARS 7012. The CMMC, where you might have to have a third party come in and sign off, may not be in your contract until you renew. In between now and that point, you may want to start bidding on other contracts, though. If you already, a lot of the contractors in the defense industrial base have multiple contracts and they want to bid on new ones, they have to have their CMMC certification before they can bid on a new one starting in May of 2023. So you don't want to lose an existing contract because you didn't meet DFARS 7012. If you've got 5 years out, you're like, oh, I don't have to do anything. Oh, hell no. Sorry for my language. You have to do those 110 controls, and you may receive a surprise assessment. You have to do the 72-hour reporting window, all of that. And a lot of the organizations that don't actually need CMMC yet are in line to get that certification done immediately when the assessors get out there and start doing the formal assessments. Now, we do expect for the assessor community to start being given the green light to do pre-assessment, get out there and do certifications early, as soon as, this is July, I'm going to say by the end of August. 1 month.
Okay. Right. And Michael, I mean, maybe it might make sense to just talk about kind of the process. I mean, we've talked about compliance as a journey. There's lots of organizations that are in decent shape, let's put it that way, say on their cybersecurity maturity, but maybe haven't spent a lot of time on the compliance dimension to it. And there's a lot of work that's involved to get somebody. So talk to us a little bit about, if somebody's in the defense industrial base, if you're a manufacturer that does have defense contracts, how long does it take to get to a point where you could confidently self-attest or be ready for an assessment?
So it's that is not a question I can answer, Chad, because it depends on what type of shape the organization's in. If you haven't even thought about this and we're starting from ground zero, I mean, we're probably talking at least a year of sitting down and writing out processes and figuring exactly what's going to stick, and then what's the training path for people and what technologies you have to put in place, who's your compliance officer. There's so many pieces that come along with it. So it's I'd be foolish to try to put a timeline to it by itself. But what I was going to say is I was introduced to Joy at a conference, and I was so impressed by her knowledge. And anybody that is going down this path, I would urge them to reach out to Joy. And this isn't, because there's so few people out there that have taken the time to become experts at this level. Joy and everybody else at Edwards, and doing that pre-assessment is critical. Like Joy said, the golden list, as she called it, is critical. Like, going through this and saying, did I do the work, right? Did I do the actual work and put in the effort? Do I have these things, here and done to a very satisfactory level where I feel really comfortable and confident that I could put this in front of an assessor and that it would pass muster? So if you're really far down the path and you feel like you're really good, then that would be a step. Or maybe it's time to look yourself in the mirror and say, how good do I feel about this, or did I just run through this and try to put some checks in the boxes? That's definitely, as Joy said, you don't want to be there.
So another question just popped in from Brian, and it's just really a practical question. And how do you know if your organization needs to be CMMC compliant? Because this is relatively new for lots of organizations, because it hasn't shown up in contracts before. And so how does an organization know whether they actually fall under the CMMC framework?
So look at the current contracts. If they have DFARS or the FAR clause, if they have just the FAR clause, the 52.204.21, they will need to be CMMC level 1 with just the 17 basic controls. If they have a DFARS 7012 clause or 7019 or 7020, some of the interim rules, they will have to be CMMC level 2 or higher, because DFARS is in reference to controlled unclassified information, and that means these 110 controls do apply to them. So if existing contract language has the FAR clause or the DFARS clause, they're going to have to, they'll see CMMC show up.
Yeah, and I think what's a really important thing to note, I work with a lot of MSPs that in turn work with clients, and there's lots of organizations and manufacturers where, you know, defense contracting clientele is only like a small sliver of the business. You know, it may only be like 10%. So there may be lots and lots of people inside the organization who don't even realize about this important level of scrutiny and regulation that's coming down the pike. But, you know, 10% is 10%. I mean, 10% is a very meaningful amount of a company's business. And the reality is the whole organization needs to raise your cybersecurity game and follow, you know, everything that Joy covered in order to really hold on to securely that 10% of that business going forward and to grow whatever you're trying to do in the defense industrial base. So there's lots of manufacturers where they serve lots of different verticals. But if you're serving, you know, the Department of Defense in the defense industrial base, ultimately through subcontracting, you've really got to address this issue head on. So.
Yeah, Ted, I have a client that I met with last week, and I really appreciated their perspective on this. They said, we're not sure if we're going to need to have a third-party auditor, but we're going to go down that path anyway, because I want to be leaps and bounds above my competition and just have that ready to go, and then I can eat their lunch, right, as we move forward. I was like, it's a great attitude, right? It's like that's what they wanted to do. And then other parts of this that are important to mention is there are tier 1 providers that are directly with the DoD, and then those providers actually have subcontractors or suppliers that roll up to them, and all those people are affected as well. So anybody that is in this and saying, okay, well, I can get my house in order. Well, it's not just about getting your house in order. You actually have to look downstream as well and making sure that the people you do business with also fall in line.
If they have access to that controlled unclassified information. Right. So it's all about how the data is shared out through the supply chain. The regulations flow with the data.
Yes.
Right, and a follow-on question, is CMMC and DFARS just meant for defense contracts? So if you don't work with defense contracts, no need to worry about CMMC compliance? I mean, is that?
That's one of the misconceptions out there. Right now, this is being tested by the Department of Defense, but remember all those agencies I showed you on the screen, all of those agencies handle CUI. So it's well beyond just the Department of Defense. This is the testing ground for imposing a specific regulation with a third party coming in to assess that's being handled by the Department of Defense. But all those other DHS, OPM, GSA, all of them have publicly said, we're watching CMMC because we're going to have to implement a similar program. So it only makes sense. The other thing I'll say about that is that there are some cybersecurity insurance organizations that are now adding CMMC or the NIST 800-171 controls to their requirements if you want cybersecurity insurance. So it's going to be a very common language very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think to be really frank, I mean, we're trying to cover a lot of ground with this webinar, and I'll hand the ball back to Michael here in a moment. But I think the reality is there's many different industries, but they all kind of converge. They converge on, the NIST framework, cybersecurity maturity in general for organizations, because whether you're a financial organization looking after client data and in the financial markets, or you're a medical practice and you have to comply with HIPAA, or you're in defense contracting and you need to look after federal secrets around weapon systems and the like, they all kind of converge on the same sort of set of best practices and cybersecurity maturity. So we try to cover a lot of ground here today, and each industry has their own unique challenges. But let's kind of just talk about, let me hand the ball back to Michael.
I'm sorry, Michael. I went a little longer than I planned.
Okay.
That's great. So, but let's kind of round it out and just talk about how NENS and a managed service provider helps organizations, go from, the compliance process to actual the brass tacks of improving your cybersecurity maturity.
All right, Chad, I got control again.
You should.
I want to see what you see.
I don't think you're sharing your screen. Yeah, there we go. And
is it showing now?
Yes, but I don't know if you're showing the right deck.
So is it Joy?
Yes.
Yeah, it was just, I put it up there to say thank you because she wrapped her stuff up. So,
Okay.
So thank you very much, Joy. So the next slide here, come on. All right. So leveraging cybersecurity and technology. I wanted to leave people with a couple of things to think about as it relates to this, because like I said, technology is supposed to be helpful, right? I mean, that's why we have it. My first question here is, who likes spreadsheets and maintaining them? When we first went down this path, we were pulling down the templates and, hundreds of lines and, having as Joy said, put the owner in it and who's responsible and then what happens next and then figuring out how to properly sort that and color code it. I mean, frankly, it's a huge pain in the ass. So, so there are organizations out there, and I would urge you to make sure that they meet, your standard and your requirement. But they've tried to simplify this. They've taken all of those questions, if it's, PCI, CMMC, SEC, SOC, whatever it might be, and you go through and you do an assessment, you answer a bunch of questions within this application. And then that application allows you to spit out where you're deficient. And then you can start putting things in rank and priority and who's responsible. And it even tells you if you're deficient in the area, things you should be thinking about what you need to do to become compliant in those particular areas. So I urge you to take a look at what's out there. We've used Concrete compliance in the past for SOC audits and not for SOC audits, but for SOC readiness. And there are others like them out there, and I'm happy to introduce you to Concrete compliance. But like I said, there are technologies out there that are going to help you through your journey, because it is quite a journey. Another thing I wanted to touch upon is how do you track the bad guys, right? So in NIST and other frameworks, it talks about how are you logging and acting upon anomalous events. So if there's something that's just a little weird in the environment that, hey, why is this pop up? What's happening? Is this an actual risk? Like, how is that happening? And there are solutions out there that are abbreviation is MDR, manage, detect, and response. Like I said, it's going to look for those events, and in some cases it can respond by itself with those events, and in others it'll just notify you that you need to do something about it. Manage risk or consistent vulnerability scanning, which is different than penetration testing, but that's also part of it. How are you ensuring that the doors are all locked, the windows are locked, right? That you put the chain on the door. So how are you making sure that there aren't risks within the environment? And can you just outsource the entire thing to a security operations center? That MSSSP that Joy had put in her slide. There are organizations out there that will do all of this for you and produce an outcome, so that you're not having to try to piecemeal a lot of this stuff together. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I definitely wanted to touch upon some things, but Joy laid out the table stakes a little earlier in some of her slides, and these are the minimum standards that we lay out for our clients. You have to have email security, you have to have a next-gen firewall, EDR, which is next generation antivirus, awareness training, which I'll cover in a minute. Critical patches and updates. Is the piece of equipment either under warranty or still supported by the manufacturer, where they're releasing the latest patches and updates? Because if it's not, you're not meeting the standard, right? So this is why these things are all so critical, and they're a part of what will most likely turn into our minimum requirements as opposed to minimum standards in the not too distant future. Risk assessment. I really want to focus on this for half a second. It is a requirement for all of our clients to complete a risk assessment, either by NENS or by an external third party. And the level of that assessment is going to depend on what it is that you need to do, right? So if it's CMMC, different ball of wax, right? If it's, hey, I just do business in Massachusetts and I need to protect my, protect PII for my employees, that's a different type of assessment. So they vary in effort, but it's something that needs to be done and should be done on an annual basis. Having written information security program, all those policies that we talked about, putting multi-factor authentication in place, and of course, disaster recovery and backup, as the last line of defense. So I'll quickly run through these, but you need to have something back to technology to make it easy for you, unless you want to go hire a whole training crew it's going to work for you and put all your training stuff together. Look to partner with organizations like KnowBe4, and there are others out there as well that have specific trainings for whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. As I mentioned, Datto, last line of defense. This is our backup partner, and happy to talk to people. And I'll have my contact information at the end of this if they wanted more information about this. And if you are in any of those regulated environments, our enhanced or advanced security is also now a minimum requirement. You need MDR, you need managed risk, you need that either managed risk with constant vulnerability scanning, or at least doing vulnerability scanning on whatever periodic basis is required. You'll need to do penetration testing, and of course, all of the policies that underpin whatever it is that you're trying to do. So these are absolute musts and requirements in that regard. And at 11:59, I'm at my Q&A slide.
All right. Let's see. I think we're pretty much out of time. There's a couple more questions that we didn't get to, but I will try to get those to the speakers to kind of follow up with you via email. But